A single decision can shatter an empire. High King Fingon stood before his captains in the fortress of Barad Ethel. His order to reinforce the watchtowers, a direct challenge to the dark shadow of Morgoth. The stakes could not be higher. The very survival of the Elven realms hung in the balance. One wrong move, one overextended force, and they could invite a counterattack that would unravel their world. This was a war of desperate choices, where fragile alliances were tested with every command. By the end of this story, you will understand the epic battles and betrayals that ultimately decided the fate of an entire age. We will uncover why a hidden kingdom chose isolation over aid, and how the arrival of an unexpected race changed everything. Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? What does the word sacrifice mean to you when a kingdom's fate is on the line? King Gwendor of Nargothrond led his elven riders through the pass of Sirion like a gust of wind, their silver banners a stark challenge to the gloom. Their orders were simple: to scout the enemy and secure the vital mountain passage. Yet when they encountered a band of orc scouts, the mission shifted in an instant. Gwendor's personal hatred for the Dark Lord Morgoth, who had once held him captive, burned brighter than any strategic caution. He gave the order to pursue. What began as a reconnaissance became a running battle, a brilliant display of elven speed and skill that drove the orcs back in disarray. The pass was secured, a minor victory cheered by the riders, but every move had been watched. In their triumphant charge, the elves had revealed the precise nature of their cavalry tactics to the enemy. More gravely, they had sounded an alarm that echoed all the way to the throne of Angband. Gwendor's choice, driven by a thirst for vengeance rather than the cold logic of war, had unintended consequences. His small win made the Noldor host feel invincible, even as it drew the gaze of a vast, slumbering power. As the elves celebrated their fleeting glory, the northern skies began to darken, not with weather, but with the promise of a coming storm. While the Noldor celebrated their minor victory, a far graver council was taking place in the heart of a hidden forest. Deep within the cavernous city of Menegroth, King Thingol listened to the plea for a united elven army with a heart of stone. His own history with the Noldor was a wound that had never healed, for they were the kin of those who had slain his kin long ago. His most trusted captain, Mablung, argued with quiet desperation for setting aside old grievances, warning that a divided elvendom would surely fall. But Thingol's ancient grief shouted louder than any council. He gave a decree that would echo through the ages. He would not commit the strength of Doriath. Instead, he commanded his queen, the Mea Melian, to tighten her magical girdle, a shimmering, invisible wall of enchantment that would seal his realm from all outsiders, friend and foe alike. This was not a retreat, but a profound act of severance. In a single decision, the potential for a truly unified front was shattered. The Noldor were now utterly alone, their military might suddenly looking terribly insufficient against the vast, unknown forces of Angband. This choice, made in a hall of glittering caves, placed the entire weight of Beleriand's fate upon the shoulders of the Noldor princes, a burden they were not prepared to bear. And while they began to draw their plans for a war, they would have to fight without their kin. A different kind of strength stirred in the lands far to the east, where a new race of beings, short-lived and full of fire, was just beginning to awaken. Far to the east, a weary chieftain named Bear led his people through a final, treacherous pass in the Blue Mountains. They were searching for sunlight and safety, a simple dream for a life, free from the nameless fears that haunted the wild lands behind them. They did not know they were entering a land already fated for epic tragedy. Their discovery was as gentle as it was momentous. The elven lord Finrod Felagund, traveling in secret, came upon them as they camped under the stars. He did not see them as primitive wanderers. He looked into their mortal eyes and saw a fire the elves had long forgotten, a courage born from knowing life is fleeting. Here was a race who valued every moment, whose bravery was not born of eternity, but precisely because their time was short. The initial meetings were filled with mutual awe and deep uncertainty. For Bear's people, these tall, radiant beings who spoke like music were like figures from a legend. Could such powerful, deathless creatures ever be trusted? The land itself tested them, with whispers in the dark and shapes moving at the edge of the firelight, proving their new home was just as perilous as the one they had left. Faced with this unknown world, Bear made a choice that would echo through history. He looked upon Finrod's wisdom and fairness, and he pledged the loyalty of his entire house to the Elven King. It was a leap of faith that bound the fate of two races together. In that single oath, the war against the darkness gained a new, powerful, and deeply fragile hope. The strength of men was now part of the struggle, but their mortality made them vulnerable in ways the elves could scarcely comprehend. As the first men began to learn the beautiful, complex speech of the elves, a different, darker sound began to rumble down from the northern wastes. The drums of war were beating in the deep, and they would not be ignored for long. A single rider traveled the broken roads of Beleriand, his purpose burning brighter than the star on his brow. Maedhros, eldest son of Feanor, moved from one elven fortress to the next, not with an army at his back, but with a desperate plea. He sought to weave a tapestry of alliance, from threads of ancient hatred and fresh suspicion. His mission was to forge a union, a combined host of all the free peoples to challenge Morgoth in his own land. The distrust was a living thing, a cold wall between his own followers and the houses of Fingolfin, a legacy of that terrible first kinslaying at Alqualanda, where elf had slain elf. Maedhros had to persuade proud kings that the only honor left was in survival, that their separate oaths were meaningless if the darkness consumed them all. The most crucial moment came at the court of his cousin, High King Fingon. Here, the weight of their shared, bloody history hung thickest. Yet Fingon, looking upon his kinsman's grim determination, made a choice that would define the age. He reached out, setting aside generations of grievance, and clasped Maedhros' hand in his. That single gesture of reconciliation shattered the deadlock. From that moment, the Union of Maedhros was born, a colossal force uniting the Noldor, the Sindar, and the three houses of the newly arrived Edain. It was a magnificent, breathtaking sight, a glittering host, the likes of which Beleriand would never see again. But it was a fragile construct, a sword with a cracked hilt. Its very existence was their best, and only hope for victory, yet its failure would not be a simple defeat. It would mean the absolute and final ruin of every kingdom, every house, and every life that had sworn to its banner. With their banners flying together for the first time, this great spear of light and steel began its long, determined march north, toward the black gates of Angband and the doom that awaited. Uldor the Accursed bowed his head before Maedhros, his words a river of honeyed promises. As chieftain of the Easterlings, he pledged the swords of all his people to the great Union, swearing a binding oath of fealty against the common foe. Here was the strength of numbers they so desperately needed, a fresh wave of warriors to bolster their lines, yet a cold unease settled in the hearts of the wiser elves. They looked at these new men from the wild east, with their hard eyes and unfamiliar customs, and felt a deep distrust. It was a conflict between ancient instinct and present desperation. They needed every sword, but at what cost? Maedhros, his mind clouded by the sheer military necessity of the moment, made a fateful choice. He set aside his own nagging doubts and welcomed Uldor into his council. He even granted the Easterlings a place of honor, anchoring the eastern flank of the entire battle line. In that single decision, the integrity of the Union was compromised. Its grand strategy, carefully crafted in secret councils, was now an open book laid upon the enemy's table. The great host marched onward, its banners a brilliant spectacle of hope, all while a slow poison seeped into its veins. As the allied armies made their final camp on the bleak, dusty plains of Anfaglith, a foul whisper began to pass through the ranks of the Easterlings, a secret language of betrayal that coiled around the heart of the alliance like a serpent. A thunder of hooves and a forest of shining spears announced the beginning of the end. The host of Maedhros surged forward as one being, a wave of silver and steel crashing against the black iron of Angband's gates. Their charge was a masterpiece of coordination, a perfect harmony of elven discipline and the raw courage of men. The orc legions, so long the terror of the north, broke before them like rotten wood. The sound was not of a battle, but of a harvest, as the forces of light reaped a grim tally on the dusty plain. For the first time in living memory, the armies of the free peoples were winning. A wild, intoxicating hope bloomed in the heart of every soldier. Victory, which had always been a distant dream, now felt like an inevitability just beyond the next fallen banner. This surge of triumph was their most dangerous enemy. It clouded the minds of the lords, turning cautious strategy into a reckless hunger for a final, decisive blow. High King Fingon, watching the enemy rout from his position, felt this euphoria take hold. The memory of past defeats and the sheer momentum of his advancing troops convinced him this was the moment to end the war. He gave the order that would unravel their grand design. He commanded a full, relentless pursuit, pushing his own wing of the army far ahead of its planned position, stretching his lines until they were thin and vulnerable. In that single, passionate decision, he committed every soldier he had to the attack. There were no reserves left, no second line to brace against a shock. The entire fate of the Union was now hurtling forward on the point of a spear, with nothing to guard its back, as the clear, brilliant notes of the elven trumpets sounded the advance. A deep, answering rumble shook the very foundations of the mountains. From the triple peaks of the Thangaradrim, a different, more terrible fire was kindled, a signal not of hope, but of a long-prepared trap, finally sprung. The sound of betrayal is the clash of a sword in the hand of an ally. At the very moment, the elven host pressed its advantage. Uldor, the Accursed, gave his true signal. With a single, guttural shout, His Easterlings did not turn to face the enemy. They turned their blades upon the elves beside them. It was not a chaotic brawl, but a cold, premeditated slaughter. The eastern flank, which was meant to be the army's anchor, became its open wound. Maedhros and his warriors found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making, caught between the renewed onslaught of the orc legions and the merciless swords of the very men they had trusted. Their perfect formation, the pride of the Union, shattered into 1,000 isolated pockets of desperate combat. The Fëanorians fought with a rage born of utter despair, their valor twisted into a frantic struggle just to breathe, to find a space to stand where they were not being stabbed in the back. Maedhros, his own body bleeding from a dozen wounds, saw the banners of his house falling one by one. In that terrible clarity, he made the most agonizing choice a commander can make. He abandoned all hope of victory and shouted the orders for a fighting retreat. He and his most loyal knights would form a wall of steel and sacrifice, a rearguard to hold the jaws of the trap open long enough for any who could to flee this field of ruin. The grand offensive was over. The battle was no longer about defeating Morgoth. It was now a simple, brutal calculation of how many lives could be salvaged from the wreck of their greatest hope. And as the center of the Union collapsed into blood and chaos, the full, undivided wrath of Angband pivoted and fell upon the isolated western flank, where High King Fingon and his host now stood completely alone. The roar of the battlefield narrowed to a single point of fire. High King Fingon stood alone, encircled by the ruin of his command. His great army was shattered, his lines broken by the very betrayal that had doomed his cousin's force. From the heart of the enemy's ranks emerged his challenger, a being of shadow and flame. This was Gothmog, the High Captain of Angband, a Lord of Balrogs. The air itself sizzled around the demon as it advanced, a whip of fire coiling in its grasp. Fingon knew this was his end. The internal conflict was a sharper pain than any blade, the crushing knowledge that his own decision to pursue, to overextend, had led his people directly into this slaughter. Yet in that final clarity, the High King made his choice. He would not flee. He would make his death a beacon, a final, defiant act to buy precious seconds for his surviving warriors. He met Gothmog's charge with a cry that was both despair and triumph, his sword ringing against the Balrog's fiery armor. The duel was a storm of light against darkness. Fingon fought with the strength of all his lineage, every parry and strike a testament to the glory of the Noldor, but he was one elf against a primordial demon. The battle was brutally short. With a crack like thunder, Gothmog's whip found its mark, and the High King's sword arm was broken. In the next instant, a great black axe fell. Fingon, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, was slain. His standard, once a brilliant symbol of hope, was cast down into the blood-soaked mud. The effect was instantaneous. The heart went out of the elven host. The music of their battle songs ceased, replaced by a single, wailing note of despair. The death of their king was more than a military loss. It was the extinguishing of their spirit. The great Union was not just defeated, it was broken. With their leader fallen, all that remained was the grim mathematics of survival. The Great Retreat began not as an orderly withdrawal, but as a flood of despair. A river of broken shields and shattered hopes began to flow southward, with the shadows of Angband pressing close behind. The flood of retreating warriors narrowed to a desperate choke point at the pass of Sirion. Here, the land itself rose up to form a bottleneck, a final, defensible position before the mountains. And here, two brothers made a choice that would echo through all the songs of later ages. Húrin and Húr, lords of the House of Hador, looked upon the crumbling remains of the elven host and saw not a lost battle, but a final duty. They commanded the men of their house to turn and face the tidal wave of orcs and trolls that pursued them. Their decision was not born from a hope of victory, but from the cold, clear knowledge of what must be done. They would become the anvil upon which the enemy's fury would break, just for a little while. They refused to abandon the elven king Turgon, their friend and ally, to be hunted down and slain. Their stand was a promise written in steel and blood, a vow that the future of the elves would not end on this day. The battle that followed was a brutal, grinding affair, a slow and terrible price, paid in lives for every single minute of delay. Húrin and Húr fought not as commanders directing a battle, but as the heart of a single, unyielding shield wall. They knew they would not see the sunset, nor would they ever return to their homes or their families. Every breath they drew was a breath Turgon's fleeing host did not have to waste. Every sword stroke was a second bought for a future they would never know. What does it mean to choose a death that serves a purpose greater than your own life? For the brothers and their warriors, the answer was etched into the stones of the pass with their blood. Their sacrifice was absolute. They held the line until the very last of Turgon's people, the last hope of the Noldor, vanished into the secret paths of the mountains, their hidden city of Gondolin preserved for another day. As the final Edain fell, a profound silence fell over the carnage, broken only by the approach of a new and terrible presence. The wrath of Morgoth, cheated of his ultimate prize, now focused with singular intensity upon the one man who still stood defiant amidst the sea of the dead. Húrin, covered in wounds, was surrounded not by common orcs, but by the personal guards of the Dark Lord himself. Morgoth's throne was not a seat of stone, but a living, malevolent will that filled the vast hall of Angband. Before this crushing presence stood a single, bloodied man. Húrin, his body broken but his spirit unbent, looked upon the source of all his world's misery. The Dark Lord offered him no quick death, but a terrible bargain. Reveal the hidden path to Gondolin, the last elven refuge, and his suffering would end. Húrin's response was not a plea or a negotiation. It was a laugh of pure, defiant scorn. He had seen his brother and his warriors slain to protect that secret, and he would not now betray their sacrifice. This was not a battle of swords, but a clash of absolute opposites, the limitless power of a god against the unbreakable will of one mortal man. In that moment, Húrin made his choice. He chose silence. He accepted that his own fate, whatever torment awaited, was a price worth paying to keep the last hope of the elves alive. For his defiance, Morgoth did not strike him down. The Dark Lord's vengeance was far more cruel. He laid a curse upon Húrin and all his bloodline, a doom of sorrow and tragedy that would twist every choice, poison every hope, and shadow every step of his family until their line was extinguished. To ensure his prisoner felt the full weight of this punishment, Morgoth did not cast Húrin into a dark pit. He bound the Lord of the House of Hador with unseen chains of power and set him high upon a peak in the haunted mountains. There, Húrin was made a sentinel of his own despair, forced to watch with far-seeing eyes as the curse he brought upon his house began its slow, terrible work in the lands he could no longer protect. The Silmaril's light, now set within the Noglamir, cast a cold gleam in the workshops of the Dwarves of Nógrad. King Thingol had demanded they reforge the great necklace to hold his prize, a task born of immense pride. He watched them work with a growing disdain, his words turning harsh and dismissive. He would not pay the price they asked for their masterful labor, claiming the jewel was his by right, and their work a mere duty. This was the spark that lit the fire. The dwarves, their own pride stung, and their greed inflamed by the close presence of the most beautiful object in the world, saw not an elven king, but a thief. In that fatal moment, their ancient alliance shattered. Greed overcame reason, and their hammers, once tools of creation, became weapons. They fell upon Thingol within his own treasure vault, slaying the king who had ruled Doriath since the stars were young. The dwarves fled Menegroth, the stolen Noglamir and Silmaril in their grasp, but they would not escape the vengeance of the elves. A host from Doriath pursued them and slaughtered the company at a river crossing, reclaiming the jewel. But the damage was done. The peace of 1,000 years was broken, and a line of blood now lay between the two peoples. This single act of murder summoned a storm of vengeance. The dwarves of Nógrad, enraged by the loss of their kin and the treasure, assembled a great army. They marched not as craftsmen, but as conquerors, their axes sharpened for war. They found the gates of Menegroth unguarded, for the girdle of Melian, that invisible wall of enchantment that had protected the realm for ages, was gone. With her husband slain and her heart broken, the Maya queen had withdrawn her power, and the hidden kingdom was hidden no more. The ensuing sack was a horror of echoing caves and shining halls defiled. The dwarves ravaged the fairest kingdom of the elves, leaving its glittering beauty a tomb filled with slaughter. The internal conflict was absolute, the shattering of a perfect, timeless safety. The people of Doriath, who had lived so long in isolated peace, were now utterly exposed to the dangers of the world their king had tried to shut out. From the ruins of a broken sanctuary, the cursed jewel found a new hand to carry it. It passed to Thingol's daughter, Lúthien, and her mortal husband, Beren, the very ones who had wrested it from Morgoth's crown. They alone understood its terrible price, having paid for it with their own happiness and lives, only to be granted a second, fleeting span of years. In their keeping, the Silmaril knew a brief peace, a quiet radiance in the woods of Osiriand, but its light was a beacon that could not be hidden for long. It drew the eyes of those bound by a terrible and unbreakable vow, the 7 sons of Feanor, who heard its call across the leagues and remembered the oath that swore to pursue it with vengeance and hatred unto the ends of the world. The oath of Feanor was a poison that took generations to run its course. Its final, bitter dose was administered at the very edge of the world, at the havens of Sirion. This was the last sanctuary, a fragile settlement of survivors from fallen kingdoms like Gondolin and Doriath, a place where elves and Edain tried to rebuild from the ashes of their former lives. And it was here that the 7 sons of Feanor came, not as rescuers, but as conquerors. They had learned that Elwing, the granddaughter of Lúthien and Beren, possessed the Silmaril. Their ancient oath sworn with such fiery pride in Valinor, now demanded they commit the ultimate sacrilege. They would make war upon their own kin. The external conflict was a horror of elven sword against elven shield, a grim echo of the first kinslaying at Alqualanda. But the internal conflict within Maedhros and Maglar was the true tragedy. They were not blind to the monstrosity of their task. They looked upon these refugees, these widows and orphans of the war they had all fought, and they felt the weight of their own corruption. Yet they chose to obey the letter of their oath over the cries of their own hearts. They prioritized a dead promise over living mercy. The defense of the havens was brave but hopeless. The settlement, built for peace, was swiftly overrun by the seasoned warriors of the Fëanorians. The streets, once filled with the sounds of rebuilding, ran red with the blood of those who had already lost everything. In that final, desperate hour, with the shouts of her people's killers drawing near, Elwing faced an impossible choice. She could surrender the jewel and perhaps save what remained of her people, or she could deny the sons of Fëanor their prize and embrace the void. Clutching the Silmaril, she chose Defiance. She fled to a high cliff overlooking the endless sea, and rather than let the jewel be taken by this twisted oath, she cast herself into the waves. With that single, desperate act, the last refugee haven of Beleriand was utterly destroyed. Its people were slain or scattered into the wild, and the final, frayed bonds of unity among the Noldor were severed forever. The cause of the elves in Middle-earth was now morally bankrupt. Its greatest champions become its most vile butchers. The war against Morgoth was lost long before his final victory, lost in this act of self-inflicted ruin. Yet from the dark waves below, a new hope was born, not of Middle-earth, but carried upon them to the west. The sea was a wall of moving shadow, a barrier of enchantment no ship had ever breached. Yet one vessel, the Gil-galad, cut through the gloom, its white sails like a remembered dream. At its prow stood Eärendil, a light upon his brow that was not of the sun or moon. It was the Silmaril, bound to his forehead, its pure radiance parting the mists of despair that had doomed all sailors before him. His wife Elwing had not perished in the waves, but had been transformed, brought to him by the power of the very jewel they had sacrificed everything to protect. Now their fates were woven together in this desperate voyage. He was sailing into the absolute unknown, guided only by a star that he himself carried. His internal conflict was a constant, gnawing presence. With every league he traveled further from the ruined shores of Middle-earth. He was also sailing away from his two young sons, left behind in a world crumbling under shadow. He was choosing the slim, almost non-existent chance of salvation for an entire world over the certain safety of being with his family in its final days. It was a choice between one kind of love and another, a burden no parent should ever have to bear. The external dangers were just as immense. The seas themselves seemed to rebel, with waves that rose like mountains and abysses that threatened to swallow his small ship whole. Monsters of the deep, drawn by the Silmaril's light, stirred in the black water below. He was trespassing on a forbidden road, and the world itself seemed to cry out against his passage. After a journey beyond time, through seas of twilight, and under skies of silent stars, a new scent came on the wind, the fragrance of flowers that never fade. The shadow lifted, and before him lay a shore of white sands and a light that was both gentle and overwhelming. He had done it. Eärendil, half elven and half man, had reached the Undying Lands. He stepped onto the blessed realm of Valinor, a place no mortal was ever meant to walk, and he did not come as a conqueror or a hero. He came as a supplicant. He fell to his knees before the thrones of the Valar, the very powers his elven kin had forsaken ages ago, and he begged. He did not plead for victory or vengeance. He asked for pity. He spoke of the centuries of slaughter, of the blood of elves and men soaking the earth, of the courage of Húrin and the despair of Turgon, of the betrayal at the Havens and the long, slow extinguishing of all hope. He offered himself as a living petition, his very presence proof that their world was worth saving. The fate of every remaining soul in Middle-earth now hung on a single question. Would the powers heed the prayer of this one mariner, or would they turn away, leaving Beleriand to its long-prepared doom? As Eärendil's voice fell silent, a decision was made in the timeless halls of the Valar. A great council was called, and the silence of the blessed realm was broken by the sound of a trumpet. It was not a sound of war, but of judgment finally awakened. The host of the Valar began its muster. The final war began not with a battle cry, but with the quiet sound of waves breaking on a shore that had not felt them in an age. The host of the Valar landed in the west, a force not of elves or men, but of the powers of the world themselves. Their arrival was a change in the air, a shift in the music of creation. They marched east, and where they walked, the shadows fled. This was no clash of armies as the world had known. It was an unraveling. The great siege of Angband was broken not by strategy, but by divine might. The Balrogs, those ancient demons of fire and shadow that had slain kings, were hunted down and destroyed, their fiery forms extinguished forever. The dragons, Glorung's terrible children, were slain in the sky and on the ground, their scales no protection against the wrath of the west. The vast legions of orcs, built over centuries of hate, were scattered like dust in a hurricane. The external conflict was absolute, a cleansing fire that scoured the land of its long torment. Yet within this cataclysm, a quieter, more personal conflict emerged. Eärendil, the herald of Manwë, stood before the surviving elves. His voice was not one of command, but of offer. He proclaimed a pardon, a chance for all the Noldor to forsake the endless strife of Middle-earth and return home to the Undying Lands. This was their final choice, a test of heart after centuries of war and loss. Would they cling to the fated dream of their kingdoms in Middle-earth, or would they accept that their long exile was finally over? The fate of an age was being decided on the battlefield, but the fate of countless souls was being decided in that single, merciful decree. As the host of the Valar laid siege to the very roots of the Thangorodrim, the land itself could no longer bear the strain. The ground began to groan, a deep and terrible sound from the world's core. The victories were absolute, the enemy broken, but the price of this final victory was now coming due. The foundations of Beleriand were cracking. The ground did not simply shake, it tore itself apart. In the final cataclysm of the War of Wrath, the land of Beleriand itself became the final casualty. The sheer power unleashed by the host of the Valar and the desperate counter blows of Morgoth were too much for the earth to contain. The foundations of the world fractured. Great chasms opened like wounds, swallowing entire forests and the silent ruins of forgotten cities. Rivers reversed their courses, flowing into these new abysses, and the sea rushed in with a roar that drowned out the last cries of battle. This was not a flood, it was a burial. The entire theater of the war, from the high towers of Barad Ethel to the hidden caves of Menegroth, was consumed. The graves of kings, the fields where armies had clashed, the homes of the Edain, all of it was dragged down into a crushing, dark silence. Only the highest peaks survived, lonely islands in a new, violent ocean, with the land of Linden remaining as the largest fragment, a lasting memorial to a world that was no more. For the survivors, the conflict was no longer against orcs or dragons, but against the very ground beneath their feet. The land they had fought for centuries to save was now actively trying to kill them. It was a desperate, chaotic scramble for high ground that no longer existed. Elves and men who had stood together in the Union now fought the same elemental terror, helping each other climb to crumbling ridges or lash together makeshift rafts as the waters rose around them. The internal conflict was a profound and heartbreaking choice. Do you stay and drown with the land you called home, or do you flee and live as an exile in a world that has lost its heart? For many, the decision was made for them by the relentless sea. They had to abandon the very soil they had bled to defend, watching as the last vestiges of Doriath, Hithlum, and all the other kingdoms vanished forever beneath the waves. The stakes in those final hours were absolute. The destruction of Beleriand was more than a military defeat for Morgoth. It was the erasure of an entire age. It was a clean and terrible slate, a forced ending so complete that the stories of the First Age would soon fade into legend. Every memory, every song, every scar upon the land was washed away, leaving only the vast, empty sea and the tales carried by those who escaped. As the waves finally stilled, the survivors stood upon those few remaining shores, looking out at a new, smaller, and quieter world. The ancient darkness was gone, drowned along with the battles and the betrayals. The sea had washed the world clean, but at a cost almost too great to comprehend. A fresh start lay before them, but it was a start built upon the drowned graves of countless heroes and the lost beauty of an entire continent. The silence after the war was a heavier burden than the noise of battle. In a camp of the victorious host of the Valor, two brothers stood apart. Maedhros and Maglor, the last sons of Feanor, were ghosts haunting the edges of their own victory. They had fought in the Great War, but their hands were stained with sins the sea could not wash away. Their father's oath, that terrible vow sworn so long ago, still coiled around their hearts. It demanded they reclaim the two Silmarils, now recovered from Morgoth's crown and held by the herald Eärendil. The Valor themselves offered them a choice, a chance to relinquish their claim and be free of the curse. But the oath was a fire in their blood that would not be quenched. It left them no peace, no future, only the terrible compulsion to possess what they had, through their own actions, made themselves unworthy to hold. In the deepest dark of night, they made their final, damning choice. They crept into the camp and stole the jewels. This was not a triumphant reclaiming of their birthright. It was the last, desperate act of thieves, and in that moment of possession, they discovered the true price of their father's pride. The Silmarils, hallowed things of pure light, recognized the murder and betrayal upon their hands. The jewels did not yield their cool radiance, they burned. A searing, agonizing pain shot through their flesh, a divine judgment more terrible than any weapon. The very things they had killed for, had torn the world apart for, they could no longer bear to touch. Maedhros looked at his blistered, smoking hand, and saw the entire history of his house reflected in the pane. There was no glory left, no victory, only this endless physical torment. In a final surge of despair, he made his decision. He would find the only fire hot enough to perhaps consume his agony. He took his Silmaril and cast himself into a gaping, fiery chasm in the earth. The jewel and the last of the eldest line of Feanor vanishing together into the heart of the world. Maglar, his own spirit broken by the sight and the pain, could not follow his brother into the fire. His was a different kind of sorrow, a vast, weary grief for all that was lost. He stood upon a desolate shore, the waves crashing at his feet. He looked at the Silmaril in his burning hand, a star that had brought only darkness, and he chose to give it back to the world. With a final cry, he threw the last great jewel far out into the sea. Legend says he wanders the coast still, a lonely figure singing songs of lament for the beauty he helped to destroy. With that final splash, the doom of the House of Feanor was complete. The jewels were lost to fire, sea, and sky. The long rebellion of the Noldor, which began with a terrible oath in a far-off blessed land, ended here on these scarred shores, not with a bang, but with the quiet, eternal sorrow of a single elf's song. The stage of Middle-earth was now cleared for its new actors. A choice more profound than any battlefield victory now lay before the survivors. With the war ended and Beleriand lost beneath the waves, the Herald of the Valor offered the elves their long-denied pardon. They could finally sail into the west, to the undying lands of Valinor, and be healed of the grief and scars of an age of war. This single offer created the great sundering of the elves, a division not of bloodline, but of spirit. For every individual, the decision was an agony of the heart. How do you choose between the land you have fought for, bled for, and watched your kin die for, and the promise of a peace so absolute it feels like a betrayal of that very sacrifice? The call to Valinor was a song of rest, a chance to lay down the terrible burden of history. But the call of Middle-earth was the memory of sunlight on the leaves of Doriath, the sound of rivers in Osiriand, the very stones that held the dust of their loved ones. It was a choice between healing and purpose, between an end to sorrow and the honor of carrying it. Gil-galad, the last in the line of the High Kings, stood on the new shores of Lindon, the largest fragment of Beleriand to survive the cataclysm. He looked upon his weary people, and then eastward, into the vast, unknown lands of Middle-earth. His internal conflict was the conflict of his entire race, made manifest. He could lead his people to peace and forgetfulness across the sea, or he could embrace the daunting task of building something new from the wreckage. He chose to stay. His decision was not a rejection of peace, but a recommitment to guardianship. He would found a new elven kingdom in Lindon, a beacon and a shield for the world that was to come. He would become the bridge between the lost glory of the First Age and the emerging hope of the Second. This single choice by their king gave heart to many of the Noldor and Sindar, binding them to a new fate in Middle-earth. The stakes of this collective decision would define millennia to come. The elves who sailed into the west faded from the stories of Middle-earth, their songs becoming a distant memory. But those who remained, led by Gil-galad, carved out their own destinies. They would become the teachers of the following ages, the guardians of wisdom, and the first and strongest line of defense against any shadow that might yet arise in the east. Their choice to embrace a mortal destiny, to live in a world of change and decay, ultimately gifted the races of Middle-earth with a guardian they did not know they needed. As the first white ships dwindled on the western horizon, the elves who stayed on the shore turned their gaze not toward the vanishing paradise, but to the east. There, on a star-shaped island, raised from the sea by the valor as a reward for the Edain, the seeds of a great kingdom of men were being planted. The age of elves alone was over. The age of men, watched over by the enduring elves of Gil-galad, was just beginning. From the drowned ruins of Beleriand, a new land was lifted from the sea. The valor, in their mercy and reward for the long suffering of the Edain, raised a star-shaped island from the depths, a gift of peace after an age of war. They called it Númenor, for the faithful men who had stood with the elves until the very end. This was more than a refuge, it was a promise fulfilled. They became the Dunedain, the men of the West, a people blessed with wisdom and lifespans far beyond those of their kin back in Middle-earth. Yet this incredible gift was also their first great test. Could they build a society worthy of such a reward, or would the very act of receiving it plant the seeds of a future fall? Their challenge was not one of survival against monsters, but of character in the face of paradise. They had to learn the delicate art of ruling in peace, of creating rather than defending, all while remembering that their good fortune was a gift, not a right. The first and most defining choice fell upon the shoulders of a man with the blood of both worlds in his veins. Elros, son of Eärendil and brother to Elrond, was given a choice no other had ever been offered. He could live as an elf, immortal and bound to the fate of the world, or he could embrace the destiny of his mortal father and join the race of men. His internal conflict must have been immense, a choice between an endless life of memory and a shorter, passionate existence defined by its very limit. Elros looked upon the Edain, the people who had fought and died beside Húrin and Húr, and he saw their strength. He chose mortality. For this decision, he was appointed the first king of Númenor, and under his wise guidance, the Dunedain forged a civilization that became the wonder of the world. They built tall white cities and great fleets of ships that sailed to the very edges of the known world. But from their highest tower in the city of Armenelos, the kings of Númenor could always gaze eastward, back towards the distant shores of Middle-earth. That line of sight, a connection to their ancient homeland, would one day grow from a comforting memory into an irresistible and dangerous longing. The great elven lords of the First Age had become the quiet guardians of its memory. Gil-galad ruled from his grey havens in Lindon, a high king without a kingdom to match the lost glory of Beleriand. Beside him, the ancient shipwright Sirion watched the tides, his eyes ever turned west, building the vessels that would one day carry the last of his people home. Theirs was not a time of empire building, but of gentle stewardship, a long, slow turning of the page. They guided the gradual fading of their people, a process as natural and inevitable as autumn, giving way to winter. The age of the elves, as the dominant force in Middle-earth, was drawing to a graceful close, and they had the profound wisdom not to fight it, but to oversee its passing. This acceptance was their greatest and most heartbreaking victory. For a spirit as fiery as Galadriel, this was an exile of a different sort. She had been refused the pardon of the valor, not for any evil deed, but for the stubborn pride that had once made her a leader of the rebellion. Where others saw a punishment, she found a purpose. Her internal conflict was a quiet, constant war between her desire for the blessed peace of the West and her fierce love for the Middle-earth she had helped to shape. She chose to stay. Her decision was an act of profound acceptance, a vow to nurture the lands she walked as a gardener tends a plot that will one day belong to another. She would not rule as a queen of old, but would become a protectress, a keeper of wisdom in a world increasingly defined by the fleeting lives of men. In the west, the elven smiths of a region, led by the brilliant Celebrimbor, reached the zenith of their craft. Their friendship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm flourished, and together they created works of such beauty that they seemed to capture the very light of the lost Silmarils. Their greatest endeavor was the forging of the Rings of Power. This was the ultimate expression of the elven desire to preserve, to hold back the slow march of time and decay. They sought to make the world as enduring as their own spirits, to create islands of eternal spring where the memory of the First Age would never fade. It was a beautiful, noble, and deeply perilous ambition. The stakes of these final acts of creation could not be higher. The legacy of an entire age, all its sorrows and its splendors, now rested on the choices of these last great rulers. Would they pass on a world enriched by their wisdom, or would their efforts to preserve the past inadvertently poison the future? As the elves of a region poured their deepest arts into their rings, turning their minds entirely to the work of preservation, they failed to notice a new shadow stirring in a forgotten land. It was not the world-breaking power of Morgoth, but a subtler, more patient evil, an echo of the old darkness that had been waiting for just such a moment of distraction. The true final battle of the First Age was fought not with swords, but with ink and memory. As the new shores of Lindon settled and the survivors mourned, the lore masters of the Eldar took up their pens. Among them, the great scholar Gil-galad gathered the scattered fragments of song and eyewitness testimony, from the proud boasts of kings to the last whispered words of common soldiers. His task was immense, a race against the fading of memory itself. The internal struggle was a constant companion, a fight against the despair that threatened to swallow any who looked too long into that abyss of loss. To record the fall of kingdoms and the deaths of heroes was to relive the grief with every single word. The choice these chroniclers made would define their legacy for all time. They decided to write not a lament of defeat, but a testament of courage. They would shape the raw agony of history into a warning and a lesson, ensuring that the valor of Húrin and the tragedy of the Union of Maedhros would serve a purpose beyond the grave. The stakes of this quiet work were absolute. If they failed, if they let the stories die, then every sacrifice made on the fields of Beleriand would vanish into utter oblivion. The physical land was gone, but its meaning could still be saved. From this monumental effort, works like the Narn Húrin Húrin were born, transforming the raw sorrow of Tirambar's life into a timeless epic of fate and defiance. These chronicles became the final, crucial victory over the darkness, a light salvaged from the drowned world, carefully copied onto precious scrolls. These tales were carried by the elves who chose to sail into the west, and they were guarded by those who remained in Middle-earth. They became a living bridge, a light from the past carried deliberately into the future, where they would wait, patient and potent, For the day, a new generation would need to understand the price of pride and the nature of shadow. The future of Middle-earth was being quietly shaped on a windswept shore in Lindon. A young Eärendil, tall and earnest, stood before the High King Gil-galad, his bearing marked by the noble grace of Númenor. Their meeting was more than a diplomatic formality. It was a collision of two worlds, each carrying the heavy legacy of a past, filled with both glorious alliance and bitter betrayal. The air between them was thick with unspoken history, the memory of the Union of Maedhros and its tragic end, casting a long shadow. Could an elf, whose people remembered the treachery of Uldor, the accursed, ever fully trust a man? And could a man, whose ancestors had been cursed and abandoned by elven kings like Thingol, place his faith in their enduring power? Gil-galad, his eyes holding the light of lost kingdoms, saw in Eärendil not a potential threat, but a reflection of the Edain who had stood with Húrin and Húrin at the pass of Sirion. Eärendil, raised on the tales of his people's great sacrifice, looked upon the elven king and saw not an aloof immortal, but the last guardian of a shared history that the sea had swallowed. Their internal conflict was a mirror of their race's grief, a chasm of ancient sorrow that needed to be bridged. In a decision that echoed the clasped hands of Maedhros and Fingon, but was tempered by the wisdom of their predecessors' failures, they chose a different path. They would not build a grand army on a foundation of suspicion. Instead, they swore a simple, profound oath of mutual aid, a vow that their peoples would stand together as one against any shadow that might arise. This was the seed, small and fragile, from which the last alliance would one day grow. It was a conscious choice to learn from the past, to forge a bond stronger than any forged in a smithy, a bond built on trust rather than desperate necessity. As their hands met in agreement, a pact was sealed that would define the fate of the coming age. This new union represented the final, best hope for a world still healing from its first great war, a promise that the strengths of elves and men could be combined not in a fleeting moment of crisis, but as a lasting bulwark against the darkness. And far to the east, in the black land of Mordor, a solitary, burning eye took note. The shadow, patient and cunning, felt the shift in the world's balance and began to stir, its plans adapting to this new, unforeseen alliance. While the great kingdoms forged alliances and fought epic wars, a quieter story was unfolding in the land of seven rivers. The Lequendi, the green elves of Osiriand, watched the rising and falling of empires from the edges of their sun-dappled forests. They had never sworn allegiance to any high king, nor had they raised towers of stone. Their power was in the living wood, in the silent paths known only to them. When the War of Wrath shattered the continent, their home was one of the few places spared the worst of the destruction. Yet the cataclysm finalized a decision they had been moving toward for centuries. The choice before them was stark and deeply personal. Would they step into the broken world left behind and try to rebuild alongside the Noldor and the Dwarves? Or would they protect the fragile peace they had cultivated at all costs? Their chieftains gathered in a glade where the river music drowned out the echoes of the distant sea. The internal conflict was a silent war in every heart, a struggle between compassion for the wider world and a fierce, protective love for their own simple, untroubled way of life. To engage now would be to tie their fate to the cycles of ambition and sorrow that had doomed Beleriand. In the end, Their decision was one of profound, deliberate isolation. They chose to fade. The chieftains decreed that their people would retreat deeper into the dwindling forests, erasing their trails and closing their borders to all outsiders. They would become a secret, a people who existed more in memory and song than in the daily affairs of Middle-earth. This was not a surrender, but a different kind of victory, a conscious choice to preserve a perfect, small piece of the past, rather than risk its corruption in an uncertain future. The stakes of this choice reached far beyond their own woodland realm. The Green Elves became a living testament to a path the Noldor had rejected long ago, a road of harmony with the land that required no rings of power or gleaming cities. Their fate illustrated the ultimate price of remaining in Middle-earth for all elvenkind, to slowly diminish, to become less substantial, until they were little more than whispers on the wind, felt but never seen. As the last of the Green Elves vanished into the deepening shadows of their trees, becoming as fleeting and untouchable as morning mist, a different, more resonant sound began to echo from the nearby mountains. The dwarves of the Eärendil, their homes secure in the easternmost surviving peaks, turned their attention inward, their great hammers ringing with a steady, stubborn rhythm as they delved ever deeper into the roots of the world. The deep ringing of dwarven hammers became the heartbeat of the Eärendil. In the Blue Mountains, the great halls of Nogrod and Belugost lay in ruins, their grand gateways shattered, and their deep delvings flooded by the same cataclysm that had drowned Beleriand. The dwarves who survived stood before the wreckage of millennia of work, their home and their history buried under stone and water. The external conflict was a monumental task of engineering and sheer stubborn will, clearing collapsed tunnels and reforging broken pillars. But the internal conflict was a far heavier burden to bear. The memory of their kin's bloody Sack of Menegroth was a stain on their honor, a shame that festered in the quiet moments between the hammer blows. How could they ask for aid or trade when their own hands were stained with the blood of allies? The dwarf lords gathered in a makeshift chamber, the air thick with stone dust and regret. They faced a choice, to retreat into bitter isolation or to risk an unprecedented gesture of humility. They decided to offer more than just an apology. They would offer reparations. A delegation was sent to the court of Gil-galad in Lindon, carrying not weapons, but masterworks of mithril, veined stone, and intricate metalwork, gifts meant as a tangible atonement for the sins of the past. They swore new oaths of peace and mutual defense, directly to the Sindarin elves who had suffered most from the destruction of Doriath. This was not a simple trade agreement. It was a profound act of moral rebuilding. The stakes of this reconciliation were immense for the entire region. If this fragile bridge of trust could hold, it would create a stable, powerful alliance in the northwest, a united front that could secure the peace for all the free peoples. If it failed, the mountains and the havens would remain divided, weak, and vulnerable to any new shadow that stirred. The elves of Lindon, led by Gil-galad's wisdom, saw the sincerity in the dwarves' offer. They accepted the reparations, and in turn, opened their storehouses, providing the food and timber the dwarves desperately needed to survive the long years of reconstruction. From this hard-won peace, a legendary partnership was born. The forges of the Eärendil, now fired by a new purpose, began to produce works of such skill and beauty that they would become the foundation of the coming age. It was from this renewed alliance, this fusion of dwarven metalcraft and elven wisdom, that the first great works of the Second Age would emerge, including the first and mightiest of the Rings of Power. The doom of Maedhros was not a single event, but a slow, cold tide that had been rising for centuries. Now, at the end of an age, it finally washed over the last of the exiles, those proud Noldor who had followed Feanor out of the Blessed Realm. The great wars were over, the land was lost, and the only battle left was within their own hearts. Each one faced a final, solitary choice, the last act in the tragedy their rebellion had set in motion. Some, their pride finally shattered by the horror of the kinslaying at the havens of Sirion, could no longer bear the weight of their guilt. They looked upon the peace of the new world and knew they had no place in it. For them, the only path was repentance. They laid down their swords, walked to the gray havens, and boarded the white ships, accepting the long-denied pardon of the Valor, and sailing into the west to face judgment and perhaps healing. Others met their end with a defiance that had become their entire identity. They were the last, lonely guardians of a lost cause, refusing to surrender even when the war was centuries gone. They would wander the wild places of Middle-earth, their eyes turned not to the hopeful west, but to the empty east, forever watching for an enemy that was already defeated. Theirs was a despair so deep it looked like strength, a final, stubborn refusal to admit their quest had ever been in error. And then there were those who simply faded. They found no grand redemption, nor clung to bitter pride. They chose a quiet resignation, retreating into forgotten woods or secluded valleys, letting the long years slowly erase their presence from the world. They became memories, their once bright spirits dimming until they were little more than echoes of a forgotten song. In these countless, personal endings, the great prophecy was fulfilled to its last, bitter syllable. The Noldor had been doomed to treachery, to the slaying of kin, and to a long defeat. With the last exile gone, repented, or faded into twilight, that shadow was finally lifted. The spiritual weight of the First Age, a burden carried by every stone and stream, dissolved into history. The world itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if a long, fevered dream had finally broken. The stage was cleared, the old debts were paid, and the future, for the first time in an age, was a story yet to be written. The language of the elves was a living thing, a river of sound that held the memory of stars and the shape of ancient trees. On the shores of Lindon, under the patient guidance of Gil-galad and his lore masters, the Edain learned to speak it. This was not a simple lesson in words, but a profound transfer of memory. The elves taught them how to build with stone, so it sang in the wind, how to read the history of the land in the lay of the hills, and how to craft laws that reflected the harmony of the natural world, not just the will of a king. The elves faced a deep and poignant conflict in this grand tutelage. They were pouring the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years into a race they knew would one day inherit the world, a race whose time was brief, but whose impact would be immense. It was a bittersweet labor, like a master craftsman teaching his final and most promising apprentice, knowing the student's work will one day completely overshadow his own. Why invest so much in a future you will not inhabit? For Gil-galad, the answer was clear. He looked upon the Edain and did not see fleeting mortals. He saw the descendants of the warriors who had held the pass of Sirion, the bloodline of those who had chosen sacrifice over surrender. He made the conscious decision to invest his people's time and trust in them, believing that the age of men should not begin in darkness and ignorance, but be founded upon a bedrock of elven wisdom and justice. The stakes of this education could not be higher. If the teaching succeeded, the fledgling kingdoms of men would be led by those who understood the long consequences of pride and the true cost of war. They would become stewards, not mere conquerors. But if it failed, if the lessons were rejected or forgotten, then the world would be left to the whims of short-sighted rulers, doomed to repeat the very tragedies that had drowned Beleriand. Under this careful guidance, the men of the three houses were fundamentally elevated. Their minds were sharpened, their understanding deepened, and their lives, touched by this refined wisdom, actually lengthened. They became the great chieftains and lords of their people, carrying a light within them that was not their own, but was now theirs to protect. As their knowledge grew, so did their horizons. They would often stand on the western beaches of Lindon, looking past the rolling waves, their eyes fixed on the bright star that hung in the western sky, the very star they knew guided their blessed kin to the promised land of Númenor. The first new maps were drawn with a mixture of grief and wonder. The great mariners of the Eldar and the Edain launched their freshly built vessels into waters that had once been dry land, their voyages a solemn survey of a world made strange. They sailed past the sheer cliffs of what was now the Gulf of Lune, a place where the hills of Beleriand had once stood. They carefully charted the long, ragged coastline that ran southward into lands they had only known from ancient tales, Eärendil and beyond. Every headland they rounded, every river mouth they marked, was a testament to both profound loss and the necessity of a new beginning. This was not merely exploration, it was an act of reorientation, a way for the survivors to learn the new shape of their home, a world that felt both alien and familiar. The cartographers worked with a quiet sorrow, knowing that the vast, intricate geography of the First Age was now compressed, simplified, and drowned beneath their keels. Yet with every league they mapped, they were stitching the known world back together, creating a shared understanding for all the free peoples. These charts became the lifeblood of the New Age. They defined safe harbors for the elven ships of Lindon and plotted overland routes for the dwarves of the Eärendil to transport their goods. They opened pathways for migration as groups of Edain, who had remained in Middle-earth, began to move inland, following the rivers and valleys marked on these precious parchments to found new settlements. Trade flourished along these newly documented corridors, with timber from the elven havens exchanged for the fine metalwork of the dwarves, all facilitated by the certainty these maps provided. Círdan the shipwright, his eyes holding the memory of countless drowned shores, made a pivotal decision. He committed the full resources of his shipyards at the Grey Havens, not just to building vessels for those wishing to sail into the west, but to this great endeavor of reconnection. He understood that to remain in Middle-earth was to engage with it fully, to foster bonds across its vastness rather than retreat into isolation. His shipwrights built swift, sturdy scouts designed for coastal survey, and his mariners trained the Edain in the art of reading the stars and the currents. This was his legacy, not a single great ship, but a web of knowledge that would tie the scattered free peoples together. The stakes of this cartographic work were deceptively high. These were not simple navigational aids. They were the foundational documents of the Second Age, the borders of future kingdoms, the routes of great roads, the sites of strategic fortresses. All would be chosen based on the coastlines and topographies first recorded by these pioneering sailors. They were literally drawing the political landscape of the world to come. One of these beautifully illuminated charts, showing the long coast of Middle-earth and the star path to the distant Isle of Númenor, would eventually be copied onto a fine scroll of vellum. It would find its way into the royal library of Armanelos, where one day a young and ambitious Númenorian prince would unroll it, his fingers tracing the vast, uncharted eastern lands, and feel a restless longing stir in his heart for realms beyond the gift of the valor. The hammers in the forges of a region sang a new and dangerous song under the guidance of the Lord of Gifts, a being of surpassing beauty and wisdom who called himself Annatar. The elven smiths reached for a power they had never before conceived. Their greatest master, Celebrimbor, felt the full weight of this moment. He was the grandson of Fëanor, the maker of the Silmarils, and in his blood ran the same fiery drive for creation, the same desperate longing to make things of lasting beauty. He looked upon a Middle-earth where the memory of the elder days was fading, where the leaves of Lorien would one day fall and not return, and he decided to challenge time itself. His ambition was not born of pride alone, but of a profound love for the world, a desire to hold back the decay and preserve the light of the elves forever. This noble dream was the very thing that made them vulnerable. Annatar's teachings were a key that unlocked doors the elves never knew were closed, and they trusted him completely, their internal doubts silenced by the sheer brilliance of the works they now produced. The external conflict was a blaze of creative energy, a symphony of craft that resulted in wonders beyond any since the First Age. They forged the rings of power. The 9 were given to the great lords of men, the 7 to the dwarf kings in their halls, but the finest of all were the 3, crafted by Celebrimbor's hand alone, without Annatar's direct touch. They were called Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, rings of fire, water, and air, intended not for dominion, but for healing, preservation, and the protection of all things beautiful. The smiths rejoiced, believing they had achieved their ultimate goal. They had created tools to resist the slow withering of the world, yet in their triumph, they had forged the very chains that could bind them. For while they worked in the open light of a region, a far darker craft was concluding in a land of fire and shadow. In the secret fires of Orodruin, the One Ring was forged. The moment its golden circle was complete, a single, binding verse echoed in the minds of every ring-bearer, a voice of absolute power that revealed the entire endeavor as a trap. "I am the One Ring," it declared, "and all the others are bound to me." The shadow that fell was not one of armies and ruin, but of a terrible, intimate betrayal. The Lord of Gifts threw off his fair guise, and the elves saw their teacher for what he truly was, Sauron, the last and most cunning servant of Morgoth. Celebrimbor's heart shattered. He had sought to preserve his people, and in doing so, he had delivered the means of their utter enslavement into the hands of their greatest enemy. In that moment of horrific clarity, he made a final, desperate decision. He would not let the 3, his masterworks, fall into that darkness. He sent them far away, hidden with the wisest and most powerful of the elves who still remained. Gil-galad and Círdan received 2 in Lindon, and the 3rd was carried to the Lady Galadriel in the distant woods of Lorien, the greatest creations of the elven smiths, born from their highest hopes, were now their most deeply buried secrets, and the war for the soul of Middle-earth shifted from the battlefield to the will of those who dared to bear them. The 7 seeing stones were gifts of pure light and foresight. Crafted in the undying west by the elves of Eldomir, they were brought to Númenor as a sacred trust, objects of such power that they were used only by the kings themselves. At the zenith of Númenor's glory, when the white ships of the Edain were a common sight in the havens of Linden, the king made a momentous choice. He would not hoard this wonder. In an act of supreme trust that honored the ancient alliance, he bestowed the 7 Palantiri upon the Edain lords in Middle-earth, especially Eärendil and his sons. This was not a simple donation. It was the deliberate seeding of a network meant to bind the far-flung realms of the exiles with an unbreakable thread of sight and sound. Imagine the advantage. A lord in Arnor could speak with his kin in far-off Gondor, as if they stood in the same room, sharing counsel and coordinating governance across 1,000 miles of wilderness. The stones became the central nervous system of the kingdoms in exile, a tool that allowed a handful of men to rule a vast territory with unmatched efficiency and unity. Yet this great power carried a profound and subtle danger. The Palantiri did not lie, but they could be made to show only a part of the truth. A stubborn or prideful mind could misinterpret what it saw, and a will that was not strong enough could be trapped and dominated by a stronger one on the other end. The internal risk was a slow poison, the corruption of absolute knowledge without the wisdom to wield it. The fate of the realms in exile was now irrevocably tied to the fate of these 7 crystals. They were the greatest advantage of the Edain, the key to their cohesion, but they would also become a target, a vulnerability that their greatest enemy would one day seek to exploit and turn against them. One of these stones was placed in the high tower of Eärendil's city, its flawless sphere of dark crystal fixed on the eastern horizon, a silent and ever-watchful eye guarding against the first stirrings of the shadow they all knew would one day return. The hammer fell silent in Celebrimber's hand. He stood in the heart of his own forge, surrounded by the masterworks of a lifetime, and felt the foundations of his world crack. The voice was not a sound in the air, but a vibration in his very soul, a declaration of ownership that echoed in the metal of the 19 rings of power. One ring to rule them all. In that shattering instant, the fair mask of Annatar dissolved, and the Lord of Gifts stood revealed as Sauron, the last and most cunning servant of Morgoth. The betrayal was absolute, more intimate than any battlefield wound. He had not been a student surpassing his master, but a pawn perfecting his own chains. The grand project to preserve the memory of the elder days, the very purpose that had driven his every waking hour, was exposed as a lie. It was a trap designed to enslave all of Elvendom, to make them willing servants in gilded cages of their own making. His internal conflict was a fire hotter than any forge. The pride of Feanor, the legacy of creation that ran in his blood, screamed for a direct confrontation, to take up his hammer and strike. But the hard-won wisdom of his people, paid for with the blood of the Union of Maedhros and the drowned kingdoms of Beleriand, whispered a colder, more vital truth. To fight Sauron directly here and now was to lose everything. The Dark Lord had already won the greater battle. The only victory left was a secret one. His gaze fell upon the 3, the rings he had crafted alone, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, They were unstained by Sauron's direct touch, the last pure expression of elven magic in a world sliding back into shadow. In that moment, Celebrimbor made his choice. He would not fight for power, but for preservation. He would defy the darkness not with a sword, but with a secret. He chose to hide the three, to scatter them to the winds, entrusting them to the wisest and most powerful of his kin, far from Eärendil. This was not a retreat, but the ultimate act of defiance. He was sacrificing his own life, his city, and his legacy to ensure that a core of unsullied light would endure. He ensured that even as Sauron's shadow fell, there would be hidden havens like Lorien and Rivendell, where the memory of the First Age would not fade, where time itself would slow its march. In this final, desperate act, the entire tragic history of the Noldor found its purpose. The pride of Feanor was tempered into sacrifice, the wisdom of Gil-galad was honored in trust, and the courage of the lost battles was redeemed. Celebrimbor's doom was sealed, but his choice planted a seed that would one day blossom into the last, best hope for all the free peoples of Middle-earth. The world we know was forged in those lost battles, a lesser world, but a wiser one. The elves, their numbers thinned and their kingdoms drowned, no longer reach for the high throne of Middle-earth. Theirs is now a quieter purpose, a long stewardship over the fading beauty they once ruled. You see this in the hidden valley of Rivendell, where Elrond, half-elven, keeps a house of learning and healing, not of war. You hear it in the voice of Galadriel, who guards the memory of Lorien, not as a queen, but as a gardener tending a final, perfect flower. Their power has turned inward, from dominion to preservation, a profound shift born from the absolute knowledge of what pride can cost. Meanwhile, the descendants of the Edain, tested in the fires of sacrifice and hardened by alliance, have been prepared for their inheritance. In the star-shaped Isle of Númenor, they build a civilization that shines with a borrowed light, a reflection of elven wisdom passed down like a precious heirloom. They are the bridge, carrying the lessons of the past into the future they are destined to rule. So what is the final legacy of Beleriand? It is not just a sunken continent, but a permanent lesson etched into the bones of the earth. The terrible weight of an oath, like the one that consumed the sons of Feanor, the luminous power of a sacrifice, like that of Húrin and Húr at the pass of Sirion. The bitter sting of betrayal, from Uldor, the accursed, to the trust broken by Sauron, and the stubborn, undying flame of hope carried by Eärendil across the sea. These are not just stories, they are the fundamental patterns of history, the recurring themes in the endless struggle between light and shadow. The world moves on, the ages turn, but the choices made in those lost battles, by kings and common soldiers alike, continue to echo. They define every conflict that follows, a reminder that some victories are not won with armies, but with the wisdom to learn from a world that was lost.
you.